Good morning, art history, and welcome back to part 4 of our content area for enrichment. I hope that you managed to complete the other ones. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys send me as far as the enrichment goes. It's really important that you continue to do the really good work that you guys have done throughout the year and finish strong. And not let the circumstances that we're in get the best of you. It's time really to begin making sure that we rise above those circumstances. And a couple quick notes that I wanted to put out there. One, the College Board sent out a survey, and I sent out an email detailing a lot of these things, but I just wanted to put this out there. College Board sent me an email with the results of a survey that they sent you guys. And of all the people that were signed up for the AP test, very few said that they were going to be taking it. So I really want to encourage you guys to make sure. I take that back. Most of the replies were unknown. People just didn't reply, which means people aren't looking at their emails. So I'm going to encourage everybody listening to this right now, and everybody who's been listening to everything that's going on and doing their enrichment, to send emails, text, whatever you can to all of your classmates and all of your classes and get them tuned back in to school, because I think a lot of people have tuned out and they just have not tuned back in. And it's very worrisome for a lot of people, not just me. I've been getting emails from colleagues in all of the AP classes, incredibly worried about the number of students showing up to Zoom meetings and Google Meet and things like that. We haven't been doing those because my sense of things is I record this, it goes on Google Classrooms, and you can use it whenever you have time. And then if you miss a meeting, you don't miss it, But I do want to do those for review sessions and to get you guys to be able to answer some questions. So we're going to be starting those next week. So I encourage you guys to get people involved. Get as many people who are not currently involved, text them, do whatever you can. And then that way, when we do have our first Google Meet, which is going to be Monday, the 20th of April, which is in a couple days, although I don't know when I'll be posting this. That way, we'll have as much feedback from people as possible and really know what we need to do to get ready. This is the last part of enrichment for Content Area 4. After this is going to be review. In fact, some of what we're going to be doing today is review. Before we jump in, though, I wanted to do a couple sort of like shout-outs / thank yous. Zach Hellman in 5th period is one of the only students who have done the My AP test on Content Area 4, and he killed it. He did a really good job, and that's even without having watched this video, so congratulations to him. Another quick one, Allison Shembry sent me what was tantamount to an art recreation that I wanted to share with you guys, and I am going to give her some enrichment credit and raise her grade, and I encourage you guys to do the same. These are the coolest art recreations I have seen in so very long time. 2 of my very favorite pieces recreated on the pockets of a pair of jeans. Coolest jeans ever. So it's good to see that other people are still keeping their minds limber and engaged with things that are going on. Today we're going to be going through conceptual interactions in sculpture from 1850 to 1950. We're basically going to be looking at all of the sculpture that we've, technically it's actually 1850 to 1980. I don't know why I put 1950. We're going to talk about something that we should have talked about previously, but the screencast went a little long, and that's the return to figural art from 1930 to about 1950. And then we'll talk a little bit about abstract expressionism, and we'll move into the abstract expressionistic movements, which are partly figural and partly not figural. They're very interesting. And then we'll do a quick rewind and review. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at Allison's pockets really quickly one more time. Awesome. We'll go ahead and start with this piece by Auguste Rodin. I really encourage you guys to watch some videos on Auguste Rodin. I'm going to make some posts. He's probably the single most important sculptor of the 19th century, so the late 1800s. He is kind of a hard one to sort of like pinpoint in terms of style. Like with many artists working in the 1800s, we go to the early 1800s and we say that there are, romanticists working through the 1850s, and then realists, and then impressionists. And you can really pretty clearly pigeonhole an impressionist and say, well, that's definitely an impressionist. When we get to the late 1800s and we talk about the post-impressionists, like the expressionist Vincent van Gogh, they're again post-impressionists. Gauguin, easy to kind of like put, pigeonhole and be like, okay, this is what they're doing. Rodin is a little bit more difficult. The one thing that we can definitively say about Rodin is that he's not a romanticist, and he's not an inheritor of the classical legacy. When we look at sculpture, we tend to look at the classical human body. And one of the things that Rodin does is he completely gets rid of that classical tradition entirely. The EQ that I gave you for this, I gave you a couple of EQs, says Rodin's work can be argued to be destructive. In some sense, he is attempting to destroy that classical legacy and go in an entirely different direction. And so in some sense, it's worth making the comparison with the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, in the sense that like they too have made a concrete decision to move away from the traditions in art as established by academies, right? And I think the classical tradition is very much an established tradition in sculpture, and he completely moves away from that. And it doesn't take, it's very easy to look at this and to analyze it formally to sort of realize that these bodies are not the bodies of the kind of like heroic, godlike athletes that we associate with the classical tradition. The clothing looks like heavy draped wool, like something you might see on a monk. They're actually bags that were given to these city leaders. I encourage you to read about this piece. It's a fascinating story of a city held hostage, and the burghers, who were the city leaders, had to sacrifice themselves to save the constituents of the city. It's a phenomenally interesting story. Their heroism is really interesting too, because we have to sort of remember that the content of this is exploring the heroes, the burghers, who are the heroes of the city who save the people, and yet they're not portrayed heroically. To portray someone heroically is very much so, at least traditionally, is to portray them in that classical tradition. Which, like go back to George Washington and look at those heroic portrayals of sculptural portrayals that we looked at by Houdon, or even that one of Washington where he's got his shirt off and looks very much like in the classical tradition. This gets rid of that entirely. It's not romanticized either. It's not romanticized in the least. These human bodies are frail and fragile. They look down. They have ugly features, big feet, big toes, big hands. If you look at some of the different images of these sculptures, they're kind of grotesque. And I think that grotesque, the decisions formally to make them look grotesque, is to capture the horror, the fear, as they march to their demise, because they were given this choice to die to save the city, and they did. And so they made a conscious choice to march to their doom. And so what Rodin has captured here with the Burghers of Calais is two things. One, heroism is not always pretty. And two, when we see, heroism, and we don't see that classical tradition, we shouldn't necessarily disregard its nature. To put it another way, these guys have sacrificed themselves, and to sacrifice themselves, they are internally, what we see on the outside, the ugliness on the outside is kind of like internally this deep-seated fear of death and torture, which we know will happen to them. I think that's kind of like what defines courage and bravery. Courage and bravery are not something that happen when you have no fear. They happen when you overcome your fear. And to overcome your fear, you have to have fear. And so I think in some sense this is a very modern portrayal of what real heroism is. It is a portrayal of fear. It is a portrayal of the fear of death, the fear of torture, but also the willingness to overcome that and to face your death in the midst of that, and to save others in doing so. The statue is also interesting in that it uses bronze, which is very much truly a classical material. And so to use that classical material is partly traditional, and yet to use it in this with this technique, I think, is to kind of like remind us of the heroism but then to also remind us that heroism is not something that we see on the exterior; it's something we see on the interior. One of the complaints by the city of Calais when they received the sculpture was that it wasn't put on a pedestal. In fact, you can see below, it's actually been put on a pedestal. The small base is very short. Rodin intended this because he wanted people to walk amongst these birders to realize that they are not any different than themselves. The only difference between them is that they made this tremendous self-sacrifice. And that heroes aren't people who rise above us on pedestals. Heroes are amongst us. And so this is an incredibly new portrayal of the meaning of heroism and what it looks like. And I think that in that sense, it's very destructive of the old tradition. However, I think that there's a couple other things to note. One is that in his technique, Rodin's technique was an additive technique. He worked with clay. And rather than working with like marble or stone, which is a subtractive process where you have to pull material away, he added material. And you can actually see when you look very closely at the work of Rodin, you can see where his thumbs were. And so he adds clay. He adds a pinch of clay to the nose and sort of pushes it in, and you can go and look very closely at these sculptures and see those prints and things like that. And so it's very raw. It's not refined. And so that decision to move away from that highly refined quality that we would associate with the classical is also another way in which he moves away from those long-held standards of formal excellence. And so I think those are all important things that sort of address that first essential question: how is this destructive of the traditional past, and also how it attempts to sort of destroy the myth of heroism. But I think that for Rodin, this is also absolutely, and this is the second essential question, celebratory, in the sense that he's celebrating this notion that heroism is something that is inside, not on the exterior. And so it sort of reflects on this idea that the common man and the common person that we stand amongst, any one of us, our fears are normal. And that our desire and our ability to, our strength, our interior strength to overcome those fears is actually what makes us heroic, and that's what is worth celebrating. The last thing that I will point out is that Rodin was working on this sculpture at a time in which Impressionism and Post-Impressionism were becoming increasingly popular. And Impressionism in particular was a style of painting that was noted for its rapid application of paint to capture a moment in time. And as a result, because it was rapid, it wasn't refined. And I feel like Rodin's work mimics that. It takes that to heart. In some sense, it is also a rapid application of clay that attempts to capture this sort of moment and is unrefined. And so I think that I don't know which way it goes. Maybe it's Rodin who's influenced by the Impressionists, or the Impressionists, vice versa. But you can kind of see that this is reflective of that moment. You can also see that this is taking something of the spirit of realism, right? The common man, and the sort of common notion, and this sort of democratization of heroism is very much something that realists were interested in, and I think Rodin here in this piece is interested in. Last but not least, the last thing I'll say about this is that this work, not just this work, but all of the work by Rodin, really sets us on a path toward abstraction in the sculptural arts. If you go back before this, you really see this turn to classicism, especially with neoclassical sculpture. This is the turn away from that. And from this point forward, we will see sculpture become increasingly abstract. And as we move forward in time, Rodin's work, I should just point out, is 1884 to 1895, which again is very much in line with the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. So for comparison's sake, Starry Night was painted in 1889. The Impressionist Claude Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare, the train station of Saint-Lazare, was painted in 1877. So this sort of fits right in there with that timeline, 1884 to 1895. It's a long time period to be working on a particular piece, but it's a very large, very important commission. When we move forward from there, the next sculpture in our set of images of the 250 isn't actually until much later, and it's around 1907. And I think that that's a really important year, 1907 to 1908. This is Constantine Brancusi's The Kiss. Let's just be clear, that's more than 20 years, or about 20 years. I guess it depends on which date you take. If we take this date here, and we say he finished this work in 1895, then this is about, 10 years after that. What's happened in that 10 years in painting? Well, what's happened in that 10 years in painting is that Impressionism has moved to Post-Impressionism, and the Post-Impressionists have each sort of like, Post-Impressionism is not a single style. It's branched out into things like Abstractionism. And abstractionists like Cezanne are more interested in the sort of abstractionists are more interested in the underlying sort of geometric nature of things, right? And then, of course, we have also within the Post-Impressionists, we have the Expressionists. And the Expressionists, like Vincent van Gogh, are very much interested in using color and form to capture emotion. And so I think that the Post-Impressionists sort of go down this route of reducing art in these sort of two directions, one color and the other sort of the underlying sort of like draftsmanship or form of things, or geometry of things. And then, of course, really importantly, in 1907, you also have the beginning of what we call proto-cubism, right? So if we take abstractionism and we move there and we sort of look at, Cezanne, and if you don't have this work, you should really take a look at it. Cezanne's Mont Saint-Victoire from 1902 to 1904. You can kind of very much see the underlying shape of the natural mountainside and things like that. And then proto-cubism under Picasso with Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Women of Avignon, also in 1907. And so this sculpture, I think, is not taking its cue from sculptures like Rodin. It is a reduction in form, absolutely. I think that really, though, Brancusi was sort of an outsider who's sort of bringing in his own form of abstraction. And in this case, the form of abstraction has a lot in keeping with things like Cezanne and Picasso, taking the form of nature and reducing it down into its underlying geometry. Looking at an object and asking this question, what is the underlying form from which it is made up of? So looking at the human face, for example, and breaking it down into a simple oval, or the human body and breaking it down into a cube. And in this case, doing so to accentuate the meeting of these two people, the sort of like the linking of these two forms, which should also remind us very much of Gustav Klimt's The Kiss. And Gustav Klimt's The Kiss was also painted around the same time. Klimt was an Austrian, and he paints something very similar. It's where you've got two forms sort of like being abstracted into a single form as they kiss. But Klimt was an Austrian. Interestingly enough, Brancusi, I believe, was a Romanian working in Italy and Paris. And so this work is taking its cue from a lot of different sources. Klimt's The Kiss, proto-cubism, and I think even like Cezanne and the reduction of things. All of these guys, all of these people are working in Paris at this time. Paris is very much sort of the center of art. So interestingly enough, like one, we have a breaking of tradition by reducing the sort of classical form into simple squared forms. But then we also have a maintaining of tradition by the use of these materials. And these materials are really quite interesting because this work uses, as you might, I think, guess, stone. So this is a subtractive process, and that's something that we normally associate with sculpture. But I think this, the word to remember here is abstraction. And I think geometry. And I think also the thing to be thinking about here is the way in which this work takes its cue from painters who are engaging in this process of reduction. And as you reduce the human form, as you reduce, and by the way, reduction is abstraction. They basically mean the same thing. As you reduce the world around you, the statements that you make become clarified, maybe they don't. In some cases, I think, like with Demoiselle d'Avignon and The Portuguese by George Braque, with Cubism, we have a reduction that actually makes things less clear. But I think here for Brancusi, I think this reduction is all about clarity and about striking a sort of simplistic, sort of clear message of the nature of what we might call primitiveness. And this is an important concept in 1907, and it's an important concept in this work, and it's an important concept in other works. For example, if we look at Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, his choice to incorporate masks from Africa was a choice to sort of access the primitive. The choice here to reduce the human form so that we end up focusing on the embrace and the kiss itself is a decision to sort of get straight to the heart of the nature of humanity and the sort of linkage between a man and a woman. And that reduction is something that brings us access to the nature of the sort of primitive in some sense. And I think that therefore we have a work of art that is trying to look beyond the form. It's trying to look beyond the form, and it's trying to access meaning through simple gesture, in this case, a kiss. And when I say meaning, I mean like human interaction, human love, and the nature of connection. What does it mean? I'm not sure that this piece really provides us with an answer to that, as much as it sort of like strips away all of the trappings of beauty to get to the nature of connection and connection between humanity, to sort of ask deep questions about the nature of why we engage in this connection. And I think in that sense, it accesses the primitive. It's a very interesting piece in that sense. I wanted to make things clear here for just a moment. I liken Auguste Rodin to Manet in many ways. One, Manet's work is very much narrative. When you look at a work like this, it begs to be deciphered and ask the question about like what's just happened here. And of course, The Burghers of Calais relates a story. So these have narrative structures. In some sense, the abstraction, whether it's the reduction of shading here or the choice not to sort of create these really sort of like as a sculptor, he could have refined his form. I think you could also make the same argument here that as a painter, Manet could have refined his painting here. But both of them choose to sort of like strip away some of that stuff to get to the content, I think, and the meaning. And so the content, which is in narrative here, I think is really important for these two artists. When we move down here and we look at this work right here, this work is by Cezanne. And of course, this work is by Brancusi, who you just looked at. It's not about narrative. It's not about content. It's, I think, mostly about form. And when I say form, I mean both of these are about that sort of abstract reduction. Let me spell that right. Abstract reduction into geometric shapes. For example, we look at the female form here. The female form has been reduced into a series of circles. Here, the forms have been reduced into cubes and rectangular three-dimensional forms. This one here, I think, is just replete with all of these sort of like spherical shapes. You just kind of like see, they're just sort of like everywhere. You realize that he's reducing even this belly here and the head here, and these shapes. He's reducing everything to its underlying geometric form. And neither of these artists are interested in narrative or content. They're interested in that reduction. And I think that reduction is supposed to sort of make plain something else. What that is obviously up to the artist. In this case, we talked about the sort of primitive nature of human connection. So I think that's important, that there is two different reasons for abstraction going on here. Yeah? Here, the abstraction in these works is to sort of strip away excess to get to the narrative. Here, it's to get to something deeper. This is 10 years later. This was first made in 1917. And it's worth sort of telling the story really quickly. Marcel Duchamp, who's one of my favorite artists, exhibited this in 1917. It was thrown away on accident later. And the piece that we're actually looking at is from 1950. Because when it was thrown away, what Marcel Duchamp did is he just picked up another urinal, signed his name, Armut, dated it 1917, which was the original date, and then re-exhibited it in 1950. So the piece that we're looking at here is from 1950, but it's actually an echo of an original piece that he did in 1917. 1917 is obviously a really important year for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's the last year of World War I. Two, it's 10 years after the Kiss, and it's 10 years after Picasso's groundbreaking Demoiselles d'Avignon. And I think that there's been a lot of time for these kinds of works to sort of settle in And I think that it's really interesting to talk about 1907, 10 years earlier versus 1917, because while it's only 10 years, maybe one of the greatest changes in human history happened, and that is the war from 1914. The last year of the war is 1917. The armistice isn't signed until 1917. The last year of the war is 1918. And the war is fought primarily in France, and Marcel Duchamp is French. When I say the war is primarily fought, I mean the Western Front is a huge portion of what goes on in the war. Obviously, a huge portion of the war is also fought in the Eastern Front and in other parts of the world. But for a French artist, this war is devastating. I think it's also worth pointing out that Marcel Duchamp had a brother, Raymond Duchamp, who's also an artist. He was a son of artists. He had other brothers. One of his brothers was killed in the war, and this is after the death of that brother. And so for Marcel Duchamp, this is a trying time. It's a transformative time. It's a time in which death, destruction has laid waste to the world, and it's directly affected him. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind when looking at this piece. The other thing to keep in mind when looking at this piece is sort of the backstory to this, which is that Marcel Duchamp was approached. He was a famous artist living in Paris during the war, and he was approached by a series of other artists who wanted to do an exhibition that represented groundbreaking art, in which their exhibition would have anybody would be able to enter, basically, is the idea. And Marcel Duchamp said, yeah, like I like this idea. I love the idea of being able to make art in which there's no school, no style, no exhibition, no master, no person who's no government, no one who's telling you what it is that you can or can't do. So he signed on to this exhibition, and he was in charge of. He was then asked to judge the exhibition, and he spent some time thinking about it. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized is like, wait a second, what do you need a judge for if anything is accepted, right? If anything can be art, then you don't need someone to judge. And so the group had begun to take submissions. And so what Marcel Duchamp did, sort of on a whim to sort of test the nature of these people's resolve, was he went to a hardware store. He bought a urinal. He signed it, Armut, dated it 1917, filled out an entry form for the exhibition. The exhibition was to happen in the future. So this was, before the exhibition occurred. And then came in secretly at night, and put in the submission. And then showed up the next day to see everybody's reaction. And everybody thought it was a joke. And everybody thought that someone was sort of abusing the notion and the nature of art, and so they refused to accept it as part of the exhibition, at which point Duchamp resigned. And to be clear, that the people who were doing this exhibition knew that Duchamp was a famous artist, and so they were using his name to make this exhibition meaningful. And so for Duchamp to resign is to sort of take away any weight from the exhibition. It's like your headlining act, not showing up to a concert. It's like selling tickets to a concert with like a headliner, and then after everybody's bought the ticket to see that person doesn't says they're not going to show up. It's a complete disaster. And so when asked why, he actually doesn't tell them, but it comes out later. People figure out later that, in fact, he's the person who created this work. And so this work was created specifically for a purpose. And that purpose was to challenge 100% the notion and the nature of what art is. and that question of what art is and what it can be and who's in charge and who makes a decision. This was created in the context to sort of ask the question of what are the boundaries about art. And in that sense, we know that Duchamp didn't make the urinal, but in presenting it on its side in the signature in this context, he makes the work of art by changing something that is ultimately functional, a functional urinal, and turning it into something that is purely conceptual. And by conceptual, I mean it no longer has a function as a utilitarian object, but its function now is a conceptual object. It is designed to be thought about, right? And the thought that you are supposed to have is obviously, what is the boundaries about the nature of what art can be and what it can't be, right? And so in this sense, this is very much the first conceptual work of art, in which the work of art really doesn't have anything to do with formal qualities. It doesn't even really have anything to do with content, because there is no story or narrative being told here. So form and content are out, right? But context, whoops, I gotta spell right, context and function are still left, right? And context is incredibly important, because without the context, it's just a urinal. But within the context of the story, and within the context of the war, and within the context of what we call existentialism, and existentialism was something that was becoming incredibly popular in France and Europe at this time. Existentialism was this idea in which people believed that in order to make the world better after World War I, they would have to renounce everything that people understood prior to the war. It was this belief that whether it was nationalism or imperialism or colonialism, or any of these thoughts and ideas and structures that existed in society that brought us to the war, all of that stuff had to be essentially destroyed, and Europe had to sort of start from a clean slate, right? And in some sense, what existed before, and this is where the term existentialism comes from, what existed before has to sort of be wiped clean, and we have to start a new existence with a new morality, and all of the concepts of tradition. And of course, tradition is so important. Tradition has a sense of morality. It has a sense of tradition is bound up in all of the things of the past. And so existentialism is about destroying tradition. Existentialism is about getting rid of old morality and old society. And in that sense, this work sort of represents, and I think the whole point of the exhibition, right? The whole point of exhibiting in 1917 in France at this moment was to sort of challenge all of the boundaries and the natures of what art could be. And to be perfectly honest, the people who wanted to put on the exhibition were not actually truly existentialists, in the sense that they wanted to actually be the ones who decide what art is and what art cannot be. And what Duchamp did was to reveal even in them that they were actually just trying to take control of tradition. And what he had done truly was to sort of obliterate with a single work the nature of art and tradition as it had been and as we know it. Even works like Cubism, which when you look at it, looks like it sort of destroys what we know of as art. It still uses paint. It still uses oil paint. It still uses form. It still uses balance and harmony. It still uses all of these sort of elements of art. It still uses nature. A Cubist work like the Portuguese or the Proto-Cubist work by Picasso, like Demoiselles d'Avignon, still relies entirely on an artist recreating things from nature. There is no recreation here. There's nothing here, because the artist didn't actually create anything with his hands. What he did create was a thought. He created something with his mind. And that's what's purely conceptual. And that's where the notions of form and content have completely been obliterated. And we've only been left with context. And that context has revealed for us function. And so the function of this work of art is to, in an existentialist manner, question the nature of not only what art is and the boundaries of art, but also ask questions about the future. And I think in asking questions about the future, this work puts a mirror up to society and asks the same question of everyone and everything after World War I. Which direction do we go now? Do we continue on this path of old content and old form that we've always continued on? Or do we break ranks in a truly existentialist way and take no concern for the morality of the past and what is good and what is right? You know, art is right because it's painted with oil paint. Do we just completely obliterate that and move on from there and create something entirely new, or do we not? And I think that that's what makes this work so incredibly radical and important in the history of art, is because it's the first work of art to do that, and it reflects, I think, society so perfectly at the time. Not just anybody can go and buy a urinal and put it up in an art museum. I know that people oftentimes say, oh, I could do that. But I think that what they miss in saying that is they think that art at that point is still about form, and it's still about content. When people say, oh, I can do that. Oh, I can paint like Picasso. I can paint like this person. They think that art is about form and content. And what Duchamp so eloquently reveals to us is that actually art has always been about the concept, the idea, the thought process. But it's also always been about the context, the timing. You can recreate a Picasso, and yet in the time that you create it, it's not the right context for the radical statement, mainly because the statement has already been made, and therefore you're purely derivative. If I were to buy a urinal and put it up in a museum today, I'm also purely derivative. And when I say derivative, my idea simply derives from a thought that has already been created. This thought here, at this time, in this context, is entirely new. And I think that's why this is so important, is the newness of it. And the sort of new thought that adds to our ability to think new thoughts. Because from this thought, we can continue to stem forward and move forward. It is deeply, deeply philosophical in that sense. And I think that this is where art sort of blurs the line with philosophy. Because conceptual art is philosophical at its heart. Just for the sake of contrast, I think it's worth noting that even the work of so this is 1917. This was also done around 1917. And it's interesting to point out because Mondrian's was done actually later, around 1930. But these artists on the left, as painters, they have maintained the tradition of form. They have maintained the tradition of content, deriving their art from nature by the utilization of primary colors. They have tried to make a declarative statement that they no longer rely on nature. And so in some sense we can say, okay, we'll strike nature from the subject and say, yeah, you are in fact no longer painting nature. Even though you could make an argument that they are by utilizing color, because color comes from nature. But they are still utilizing form, right? And so in some sense, you could make a clear statement that this makes this even more radical in terms of its in terms of its abstraction or its reductionism, in terms of its reducing things down, not for the sake of abstraction, but for the sake of art and asking questions about the nature of art. And so I think that these are worth pointing out, that you know, like as we sort of look at these pieces, that that artists are thinking about what art can be for the future. And I think that why we study this piece as opposed to this piece is because this piece asks the question in a far more radical fashion. Moving on, we sort of jump significantly into the future as we move from 1917 to 1936. And as we move to 1936, we have obviously skipped over the 1920s, the so-called roaring 20s or golden 20s if you're in the late 20s in Germany. We've skipped over the stock market crash of 29 and the global depression that occurs in the 30s. And we arrive at a point in France, once again in Paris, once again with Picasso. This is actually Marais, the artist who created this is Marais Oppenheim. And story goes that Marais Oppenheim was at a cafe with Pablo Picasso. And they were sipping coffee or tea or something. And Marais Oppenheim, I believe, had either a fur bracelet or a fur coat or something like that. And as she's sipping her tea, Picasso complimented her and said, you know, you could cover anything in fur and it would be elegant. And so Oppenheim directly went home and began work on Objet, or Le Déjeuner in Fourrure, which is the breakfast in fur, or the lunch in fur, also known as the object. And you could make the argument that it's Picasso who inspired the work through his comment that you could put anything in fur and it would look elegant or beautiful. But I think that what Marais Oppenheim was really actually trying to do, she was what we call a surrealist. She'd been hanging out with the surrealists in Paris, people like Salvador Dali, people other surrealists whose names escape me for the moment. And they had been talking about Freud. They'd been talking about Sigmund Freud, who was, of course, the brilliant psychoanalyst. And I think that what Marais Oppenheim sort of understood about the nature of what Picasso said is it's not so much that this was inspired by the comment by Picasso, but rather that she believed this to be a kind of what we call a Freudian slip. And that there was something in Freud about what fur means and the kind of objectification of fur as a sexual object, kind of. And if you go and read through Freud's work, you'll sort of find out more about that. And so I think that she engaged in this object because she wanted to create something that was at once, I think, subconsciously, I can't spell today, man. Subconsciously attractive, meaning that our kind of like our reptile brains, like some part of us sort of deep in our subconscious. And to be clear, your subconscious is below your conscious. The conscious is that which you can think about. The subconscious are things that exist within your brain that you can't think about. Meaning you can't actually have a conscious thought about it being attractive. So if you're all sort of disagreeing with me and saying that it's not attractive, you're absolutely right, because Freud would argue that exists in your subconscious and you can't access that thought. Making Freud's theories incredibly difficult to disprove. But in our conscious mind, it is repellent. And I think that I think quite clearly, like the idea that something would be covered in fur and we would put it up to our mouth repels us. And so Oppenheim captures this duality of the mind. And I want to point out, I think, what is so incredibly important here about this is that when we talk about an object that is meant to sort of capture the duality of the human mind and the human conscious mind, it's incredibly important to realize that what this work is operating on is on the conceptual level. It's all about the nature of thought. And therefore, it can't have existed without something like Duchamp's The Fountain, which you guys know to be a urinal, right? And so the birth of conceptual art, I think, birthed with it other movements. In fact, I think that conceptual art absolutely is a precursor to surrealism. Because surrealism and surrealist art is all about accessing the mind and the thought patterns that exist in the subconscious part of your mind, in the part that we can't access. And surrealists believed, kind of like Freud, that the cure to society's ills, whether it be fascism or extreme nationalism or the ills of World War I and imperialism and God knows what other human problems that occurred between World War I and World War II. Surrealists believed that there was a lot of damage and a lot of stuff that existed in the subconscious mind. And that the healing balm for society was to find ways to get the subconscious mind to kind of like bubble up to the surface. So if this is the line where we have consciousness here and we have subconscious here, right? You engage in works of art and creations that cause that which is in the subconscious to start bubbling up to the conscious. And only when the subconscious meets the conscious and we're actually able to talk about in a meaningful way our subconscious minds can we actually begin the healing process of that which is in our past. And that's exactly what Freud's psychoanalysis is all about. It's all about dragging up this sort of stuff that exists within your subconscious mind to make peace with it so that you can move forward. And so surrealism was a form of art that engaged in this kind of like psychoanalysis. Now, most surrealists engaged in a completely different type of art than this. They were painters, and they would do things like they would take sponges, dip them in paint, and then splat them on a canvas in order for the splats to pull something out of their subconscious mind, and then they would paint it, right? But either way, they were trying to gain access to something that was buried beneath. Murray Oppenheim, I think, tried to capture what she believed was actually beneath, and I think this is important, what was beneath Picasso's words, right? Which was that underlying subconscious attraction to fur. And the nature of and the connection between a woman and fur, I think, as well. So we sort of dig deeper into Freudian concepts. And so this work is about revealing that. And I think that the last thing I'll say about this is that what was beneath Picasso's words, I think, are actually beneath, or at least Murray Oppenheim, I think, perhaps hints at and suggests that and believes that maybe was beneath all men's words, that underlying all men's subconscious is this sort of like underlying attraction to fur. One of the most famous surrealists, Salvador Dali, oftentimes painted works like this, which appear to be sort of like dreamscapes, right? That are out of this. So they take objects from our conscious mind and they transmogrify them, to use a Calvin and Hobbes term, into something from our subconscious dreamscape. so that's 1936. The next work of sculpture that we have, we don't really look at for a really long time. Unless you want to make the argument that we have to look at the ready-made piece by Marcel Duchamp from 1950. We don't get another work of sculpture for a really, really long time. It's not until 1966. And this is the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. And the work is called Narcissus Garden. This is an important work of sort of like what we would call post-modern performance art. Performance art is when the artist creates a work of art that is designed to be in a particular moment. The context, once again, is incredibly essential. And so right from the get-go, when you start talking about context and performance, the meaning of the art, the function and the meaning of the art is found in that moment. So what she did was she went out and she had all these mirror balls and she was selling them to people. And she claimed to sort of be selling them their narcissism, right? And of course, when you looked in the mirror ball, you saw yourself, just like when Narcissus looked and stared at himself in the pool of water, right? And of course, narcissism is a kind of like commentary on our self-obsession, right? Narcissism is not just about self-obsession, but it's about a self-obsession with our own outward beauty. And so to go out into society, and I believe this was in New York that she first did this, where she was selling these mirror balls. And she has this garden of them floating in pools, right? And so it's Narcissus's garden. And of course, Narcissus's garden is loaded. It's loaded with sort of like classical symbolism, because obviously Narcissus was a classical figure. He was a classical mythological boy who considered himself so beautiful. He fell in love with himself after seeing himself in a pond of water, in a pool of water. And he spent his days staring at himself, right? There's a Narcissus flower. And of course, that also gets to the notion of a garden, right? There's the Narcissus flower, which is this incredibly beautiful flower. And so they are both, all of these concepts are sort of synonymous with self-obsession with outward beauty. This is obviously 1966, but I think it's such a potent commentary on society today too, just to sort of like put that out there. We'll sort of dive into that a little bit later though. But Yayoi Kusama here is selling us our own narcissism. And in doing so, she is attempting to generate a thought in the viewer's mind, right? And it's not even so much that we can say that we're viewers at this time, because it's a performance, we are participants. Now, she's not the first to engage in this kind of performance art, but I think it's really important to sort of talk about some of these things. One, postmodern performance art, like the work of Yayoi Kusama, is on the one hand conceptual. These are manufactured objects that she didn't manufacture herself. She hired people to manufacture them. So they're no longer interested with form and content in terms of the traditional sense. What they are interested in is the context, the moment of selling these to the public, right? And function, right? The idea of the viewer or participant seeing themselves in the mirror and reflecting on the nature and the thought of what it means to be narcissistic, right? So this is conceptual on the one hand, and on the other hand, it also, this is something I hope you'll be willing to take notes on. On the other hand, it also changes the role of the viewer from from a passive viewer to an active participant, right? And we're going to talk about this work later, but I think it's just important that we sort of note that at this point you are not in a museum. You're in a public space. And each person's interaction with this is designed inherently, on the one hand, yes, to be about narcissism, but it's not supposed to be about Kusama's narcissism. It's supposed to be about their own narcissism. It's supposed to be about their own thoughts as they buy the mirror ball to look at themselves. This performance art rejects the notion that art belongs in a museum. And by the way, this gets to EQs that you should be answering about this work. Both this work is designed to be public art and get people to interact with it differently. And then the second EQ says both works intend viewers to interact with the work and consider themselves in the context of the art or the context of the work. And so you want to be able to describe that function that Kusama intended purposefully for each viewer to interact as a participant, not just a viewer, to purchase, and in the act of purchasing, that creates the thought as well as the mirror itself, seeing themselves. Each person sees something different. They don't see the same work of art because each person is seeing themselves, and each self is different than the other self, and each person's relationship to their own narcissism is different, right? And so the function is the thought within the head of the participant. And so, these things are getting incredibly complex, right? But I think it's also really important to sort of realize that, society in the 60s was becoming an increasingly narcissistic society. And I'm just going to skip forward here to this piece, because this work, the Maryland Diptych, is a painting, and it predates Kusama's Narcissus Garden by 4 years. This is from 1962. Kusama's work is from 1966. And with the birth of television, and then the creation of Hollywood. We should start with Hollywood in the 20s. Television, we should go first to film, and then Hollywood in the 20s, film in the 20s, color film 1938, and then film stars, right? And the notion of film stars. And then the so-called icon, or maybe a better word is to use the word idol, right? And obviously this piece is exploring Marilyn Monroe's incredible fame after her death. And I think that, what's interesting is on the one hand, you see black and white repeated images that mimic the daily images of Marilyn Monroe in the newspaper, as you read stories about her, and maybe as they fade from memory. And then on the other side, you see her constant recreation in our minds through film, because films don't fade from memory, and the repetition of her image that sort of reinforces her in our mind, creating the notion of an icon. And then also by repeating this image, I think that we also have to deal with the notion of her fame as well as Andy Warhol's fame. And then we also have to deal with the fact that icon and idol, she's an idol, she's absolutely an idol, but icon and idol are both artistic but also religious terms. An idol comes, we can talk about the word idolatry, And of course, when we talk about the word idolatry, we have to talk about the concept of idolatry in the Bible. Warhol was raised religious, and he makes religious commentaries in his works. And we'll talk about some more religious concepts in his works as well. Idolatry in the Bible is obviously sinful. And yet we use the word idol to sort of retain and talk about these people who we love. And so, and of course we know there's something deeply kind of like sinful in some sense. She represents sin. Marilyn Monroe represents sin. She represents this woman who had affairs with the president of the United States. She represents this woman who is highly sexualized. So what we have here is the degradation in some sense of sin is a bad thing and idolatry is a bad thing, and the reworking of those things into religious iconography. And here we have the concept, the word icon. An icon is someone of great fame and iconic, right? But icon and these terms come to us from iconography and the study of icons. An icon was originally a work of religious art put up in a Byzantine church, an image of Jesus. And so what is so powerfully interesting about this is our notion of her sexuality and sin and the idolatry within that has been subverted into our own icons. And so this becomes an image that is definitively about our worship of her and our worship of her lifestyle and our desire, I think our deep-seated desire to have her fame and to engage in her kind of sin. It doesn't take much looking around to look at someone's Instagram to sort of realize that this is playing out writ large today, that countless people throughout the world are trying to recreate her fame and her sin, and her repetition of imagery, and her and not necessarily her narcissism, but the concept of narcissism. And so we have these incredibly foreshadowing notions here about the nature of our society. Both Yayoi Kusama and Andy Warhol revealed so much about the nature of society in the 50s and 60s that has only become deeper today. It has become enriched today with the internet and with the repetition of image. It has become enriched to the point where we no longer even think about the notion of our own idolatry and the way in which we subvert religious iconography. But anyway, the other thing we should point out is that it exists on this axis, right? And so there's this sort of notion of duality that sits here. And yet that axis is supposed to also suggest the concept of a diptych. And a diptych is, of course, like a triptych, a religious imagery. It's meant to remind us of the kind of object that sits on an altar in a church. And so once again, reminding us of our worship of the image and of the concept and of the idea of her. And of course, we are worshiping the idea of her. And I think that Warhol's repetition of her image is there to remind the viewer that the repetition of the image separates. The repetition of the image separates, and I think that maybe this cutting here of the news clippings of her real life from the sort of repetition of the image in film of her film life sort of reminds us that the real and the ideal, we take Marilyn Monroe's life from film and from the popular stories, and we think that is in fact her real life. And so we've not only confused the religious with sin, but we've also confused the real with the ideal. Because in fact, we think her real life is the ideal life, hence why we set out to try and recreate it ourselves. And of course, Warhol talked in the 60s about all people having their own 15 minutes of fame. And boy, was that foreshadowing too, because today it's true. And so it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, only for us maybe at some point to sort of realize that this was just after her suicide, and she was a deeply unhappy person. And so the work reveals to us, although it takes some thinking, that in fact, that which is the life concocted on the surface, that is very much the image that we see on the surface, like Instagram, for example, once again, the images that we see on the surface are not in fact reality, and that in fact the reality was something deeply troubled, mental illness and the like, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and all of the sorts, and a deep-seated unhappiness that would result in her overdose and potential and probable suicide. So the real and the ideal are confused. And yet, even though the real and the ideal are confused, I think that as people read the stories of her suicide and things like that, they also romanticize them, once again continuing the confusion. And so I think this work of art truly, very much so, like Yayoi Kusama's mirror balls, literally put a mirror up to society and reflect our values as we leave what had been our sort of Protestant values behind and move into a much more existentialist future, in which our future values are concocted for us by Hollywood and other powerful sort of media outlets, and so once again, running through the 20th century, we have these themes of existentialism, and the destruction of old values, and the duality of the human mind and the subconscious versus the conscious mind, the revelation of the conscious mind, the revelation of the subconscious mind to the conscious mind, through the creation of works that are designed to reveal something to the participant and the viewer, and the decision by the artist on the artist's side to sort of capture our society's grand decision to replace religious meaning and iconography and images of Christ with images of our new idealized Hollywood heroes, and our desire to be like them. And so these are deeply reflective of incredibly values that are changing at an incredibly rapid pace in America and in American society. On that same track, the last sculpture that we'll talk about, and I know that we sort of threw in a painting in between there, but I thought it was sort of important to talk about. This is Lipstick on Tank Tracks from Claes Oldenburg. It's from 1969. And it, too, is dealing with not issues about identity and issues of ourselves and our religion, but it's really sort of exploring. I mean, it is partially. It's exploring gender roles. It's exploring the Cold War, because this is an ICBM. So it's exploring historical topics, but gender roles in the sense that, this is, as I think we discussed briefly before we left, a phallic image in the form of women's lipstick. And so the power of the phallic image in the form of the lipstick might remind, which is also a ballistic missile, might remind someone of the feminist movement, which was active at this time. It might remind you of the anti-war movement, which was active at this time. It might remind you not only of the Cold War, but also this became the center of many anti-war demonstrations. And so in that sense, we have to sort of think about this in the context of the Vietnam War. 1968 was the worst year of the war, and this was being built in the midst of that. Vietnam War, and protests centered around this at Yale University. This was designed to be put out at Yale University. And of course the tank, one other thing we should point out is in 61 to 63, you had several events, but in 61 you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Sorry, let me rewrite that. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, is when they found ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, on Cuba. And they were the combination of the missile itself with large tracked vehicles that had tank tracks to move them around, and then erect them to shoot them at the United States. And because Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of the United States, they could reach every major city in the United States, launching, if they wanted to, a nuclear attack on the United States without our ability to actually retaliate because of the short distance. And so creating probably one of the greatest fears incredible fear, one of the greatest fears in modern history. And then, of course, you have the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. You have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was running for president, in 1968. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. You have the increasing militantism of the civil rights movement. So while we associate the civil rights movement with people like Martin Luther King and its peaceful nonviolent demonstrations, by 1969, when this work was created, you actually had leaders that were coming to the fore, like Malcolm X, who were actually advocating for much more violent means of change. And that scared people. And so this work sort of explores the notion of war, not only outside of our society, but within our society. It explores the notion of gender within our society as well, and women attempting to sort of rise above. Women oftentimes took part in protests. And so, this thing also, because of its sort of phallic representation, seems to sort of like denote the notion that very common, and it was probably chanted around this, like when they had protests, people would gather around this, whether they were anti-war protests for the Vietnam War, whatever, feminist protests, and people would chant the saying, "Make love, not war." And so I think the idea of the lipstick that sits above the tank tracks, right, perfectly sort of captures that statement, that notion. And so this is a work that, once again, like so many of these other works that we've looked at, puts a mirror up to society and captures all of the deep-seated fears and all of the sort of things that are occurring in society, and sort of like summarizes them in a single work that reflects who we are at this particular time. The work originally was designed to have this top part was designed to be inflatable. And so it would inflate and deflate. And in that sense, it was supposed to be part of the performance art movement in some sense. The last thing that we'll talk about is, in terms of sculpture, is something that is hard to sort of like denote whether it's actually sculpture or not. And it is earthworks. And this is an earthwork right here by Robert Smithson. It's in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. You can actually go and see it to this day. This was actually made when the water level was actually really low. The water level has since, it's an earthwork. The water level has since risen and then fallen several times, and because it's the Great Salt Lake, you can actually see salt deposits on the edges, but as the water level has risen, it's actually deposited salt all around this thing. And so today, if you look at it, you actually have this massive strand of a spiral. It's called the spiral jetty because it's a jetty on the one hand and spiral on the other. You have this massive spiral jetty that is covered in white salt crystals. It's absolutely gorgeous today. And this, of course, was done in 1970. And so very much like Klaus Oldenburg's lipstick on caterpillar tracks, this piece was, really appropriate in that, what was it, April 22nd, 1971? 71 was the first Earth Day. And this massive earthwork piece sort of captures the relationship, I think, beautifully between humans and the earth. The spiral is believed to be a Native American symbol of life. and yet it took massive amounts of modern, like, industrial tractors and earth movers and things like that to create the spiral. And so it's at once, like the Great Serpent Mound in Content Area 1, which was made by Native Americans, and, I don't know, Stonehenge from 10,000 BCE in England, sorry, it harkens back to these sort of like monumental human creations that were created with, that were created to make profound statements about society, religion and society and things like that at those times. This sort of mimics that, and yet at the same time, it is nothing like that, because it's entirely new and made entirely with different substances and all of these things like that. So it's at once very much sort of a primitive work of art, and yet it is made with materials, or it's made by materials that can only be utilized today, by which I mean like heavy machinery and things like that. And so it's sort of dualistic in that sense, but it celebrates man's connection to the earth, I think. And I think it contemplates man's connection to the earth. And I think the way in which the water deposits its salt and the water sort of slowly takes it over reminds us of the interactions between humanity and the earth. And I think that is actually what Robert Smithson wanted to do, is sort of like recognize and capture this belief in this idea and this notion that there's a constant interaction between humanity and the earth. And that even something as massive and monumental as this gigantic jetty, and you can walk out on it, it's huge, is still shaped and changed by the ever-changing earth. And I think that's, of course, obviously appropriate, because the first Earth Day gave rise to, the environmental movement. And the environmentalists who had read, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, who were incredibly worried about industrial poisons leaching into the environment, destroying the environment and things like that, and pollutions, and the interactions between humans and the earth, and the way in which we have this sort of disastrous effect on them. And so this is a work that sort of contemplates our interactions and contemplates the positive or negative interactions, and things like that. And I think that obviously it puts a mirror up to the environmental movement of the 1970s and the things that we believed at that moment. I'm going to stop there. That's sculpture, and I'm going to post this as sculpture, and then I'll do one more video on figural arts, because it really is going to be sort of a different kind of thread, and this one has gone on quite a long time. So watch this one, go through all those sculptures. I really did go all the way to the 1960s, which was cool, and made some sort of like prescient comments on the nature of who we are today, and so I think you can kind of utilize that to think about the interactions between sculpture and painting, and the trends in painting and the way in which they affected sculpture, and the way in which sculpture and painting slowly sort of like they almost kind of like merge, right? And even architecture and things like that. Like if you look at this piece here, it's built, Klaus Oldenburg is like an architect. He'd plan these giant things and then hire people to put these things together and use a combination of paint and resins and polyurethane and steel and aluminum. And so we're really sort of like sculpture is like moving into this sort of mixed media phase. When we look at this, obviously this is a painting in some sense, but in another sense, like Klaus Oldenburg's Lipstick on Tank Tracks, Andy Warhol never actually touched this. This is screen print, like the way you would make a T-shirt with printing material, industrial printing materials, and the rapid printing. And so there's no painting that goes on here. It's just screen printing on I don't even remember, is it on canvas? I think it is. Let me just. It's oil on acrylic and silk screen enamel on canvas. Yeah, so it is on canvas. And so the sort of industrial quality of all these works, I think, is really important. And we're really sort of moving into into this sort of mixed media era where it's not about painting, sculpture, and architecture. They're all sort of like blending into one another. So I'm going to come back with another video on the figural arts, but this one has gone on for quite a long time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're getting to the very end of this, I'm going to ask you to do me a really, really, really big favor. Once again, contact every single person that you know that is in art history and tell them that this material is online and they need to study and prep for the test. And they need to join us for our first Google Meet and all of these things like that. Would you do that for me? Thank you, guys. I hope to see you in a couple days at the Google Meet. We'll see you later.